Within 10 years, that is, from January 16, 1966 to February 13, 1976, Nigeria experienced 4 military coups. 3 of them were bloody. Only one was bloodless. This episode aims to take a look at the history of military coups in Nigeria from January 15, 1966 to the return of democracy on May 29, 1999. The coup story in Nigeria began in the early hours of January 15, 1966, when Major Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogu and his colleagues in the Nigerian army struck. With the summary sacking of the First Republic by the January Boys, as they would later be popularly known, the course of Nigeria's political history was irreparably altered. Soon after the bloody carnage, Nzeogu offered reasons to justify their action. His broadcast identified as enemies, in quotes, the political profiteers, the swindlers, the men in high and low places that seek bribes and demand 10%, those that seek to help the country divided permanently so that they can remain in office as ministers or VIPs at least, the tribalists, the nepotists, those that make the country look big for nothing before international circles, those who have corrupted our society and put Nigerian political calendar back by their words and deeds. End of quote. Nigerians today harbor different perceptions about the January 15, 1966 coup, which marked the beginning of a new era in Nigeria's history. However, there is still an agreement that before the putsch, there were barely tolerable acrimonies and dichotomies along tribal lines. Commentators continue to question the propriety and timeliness of that action, even as the topic remains open to individual interpretations and rationalizations. However, ascertainable facts can only aid our collective appreciation of where coups have left Nigeria as a nation. Before January 15, 1966, there were blatant electoral malpractices. There was palpable distrust and tribal hatred. The future was uncertain. Then dramatically, 5 army majors decided that it was time to effect change at the center. When they finally struck, it was damn bloody. The citizens were terribly shocked when top-ranking government functionaries, including the Prime Minister Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, were killed in a selective elimination that tended to give the whole exercise an ethnic coloration. Others who died were the Premier of the Northern Region, Sir Ahmadu Bello, the Premier of the Western Region, Chief Samuel Ladoke Akintola, and the Finance Minister, Chief Festus Okotie-Ibo. In the army, Brigadiers Samuel Ademulegun and Zakari Meimalari, Colonels Raf Shodayinde and Kor Mohammed, Lieutenant Colonels James Yakubu Pam, Abogo Lagema, and Anthor Chinyelu Negbe were brutally murdered. Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe was at this time the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, but he had left for overseas shortly before the coup. This way, he survived, but tongues were sent wagging as to whether his trip was as a result of any privileged information. Dr. Michael Okpara, the Premier of the Eastern Region, was also a survivor of the first military intervention in Nigeria, among others. Despite the resistance mounted by troops loyal to the incumbent Balewa administration, Nwafor Orizu, who was the then Senate President and acting President, would not be convinced that there was enough peace for democratic governance. As a result, he announced the cabinet's handing over of power to Major General Johnson Thomas Umunakwe Aguiyi-Ironsi. The latter's introduction of a unitary system of government on May 24, 1966 was most ill-advised and roused some ill tempers. Ironsi's military government would last for only 6 months. Owing to the high number of northern casualties in the January coup, the intervention was seen as one directed at that tribe. And when the North took its pound of flesh on July 29, 1966, it was such a colossal tragedy for the Igbos. The then head of state, General Ironsi, was assassinated in Ibadan with his host, Lieutenant Colonel Adekunle Fajuyi, the military governor of the Western region. Other officers of Igbo extraction suffered a similar fate. They comprised Lieutenant Colonels Gabriel Okowenze and Israel Okoro, Majors Dennis Okafor and John Obieno. In addition to these Igbo officers that were killed, no less than 100 non-commissioned officers died and thousands of innocent civilians, mostly of Eastern Nigerian origin, lost their lives as a consequence of this coup. Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, a 31-year-old bachelor and chief of army staff, became the new head of state and supreme commander. He was one of the main survivors and a key beneficiary of the July coup. Gowon would go on to rule Nigeria for about 9 years until he was overthrown in a bloodless coup while at an OAU summit in Kampala, Uganda on July 29, 1975. For nearly 9 years, Gowon piloted the affairs of the country. During the days of the oil boom, he occasioned some developments even though there were whispers about corrupt enrichment by some of his officials. Having accomplished the return of the political administration of Nigeria to the north, Gowon set out to restore Nigerian federalism and created 12 states to decentralize and check Emeka Ojukwu's Biafran agitation. Again, his regime had fashioned the democratization process that was designed to enthrone civilian governance by 1976, but when he placed the midwife in aborting that dream in an Independence Day broadcast on October 1, 1974, Gowon had won more enemies, relentless critics, and unyielding cynics. While General Yakubu Gowon was attending an Organization of African Unity (OAU) Heads of Government Summit in Kampala, Uganda, some disenchanted officers in a broadcast by the then Colonel Joseph Navengaba took over the reins of power in a bloodless coup on July 29, 1975. Consequently, Gowon and his other subordinates were the major victims in this change of baton that took the nation, as usual, by surprise. Brigadier Muritala Ramat Mohammed became the biggest beneficiary as the next head of state. Born in Kano, Muritala, as he was popularly known, climbed the rostrum in style and endeared himself to the national heart courtesy of his crusade against corruption and the war he waged to ensure accountability. However, like Ironsi, Muritala would not last long on the seat. The head of state was gunned down in his prime. The coming of Muritala Mohammed was short-lived. He ruled as head of state for only 200 days. On February 13, 1976, he became the second military head of state after Ironsi to be assassinated while in office. He was only 37. The nation grieved over this overthrow, which was orchestrated by Colonel Bukasu Kadimka. He had other collaborators who were mostly young officers of Middle Belt origin. Mohammed was the ultimate loser. He lost his life as well as the headship of Nigeria. Having lost their breadwinner, his family became a major victim in the bloody coup. Colonel Ibrahim Taiwo, who was at the time the governor of Kwara State, was also killed by the coup plotters. Between the Fulani Muslims and the Middle Belt Christians, there was evident tension that spread to the nooks and crannies of the country. One, Gowon, who was a Christian Middle Belter, was replaced by Murtala, a Fulani Muslim, while officers from the former geopolitical area had planned a coup that toppled and killed the head of state. A military tribunal was set up to try the coup suspects. When the trial was over, no less than 30 officers, mostly from the Middle Belt, were summarily executed. These included Dimka, who led the coup, Defense Commissioner Major General Ilia Bisala, and the Benue Plateau Governor Joseph Gomwok. General Olusegun Obasanjo, the second in command, was not hit by the bullets of the coup plotters. As a Yoruba Christian, Obasanjo was also a stabilizing factor that would cool the tempers and avoid any confrontation between the Christian Middle Belt and the Muslim North. Shehu Musa Yaradua, a young Fulani lieutenant colonel, was double promoted to a brigadier and subsequently a major general, as he became the chief of staff, supreme headquarters, only next to the incumbent Elsman, Obasanjo. Other key members of the cabinet survived the February 13 coup. Such included Lieutenant General Theophilus Yakubu Danjuma and Major General Joseph Narven Garba, who was the Federal Commissioner of External Affairs. Other generals like Martin Adamu, Emmanuel Abisoye, and Alani Akinrinade came out unscathed in the scare. So did Vice Admiral Alani Adelanwa, the Chief of Naval Staff, Air Vice Marshal John Yisadoko, the Chief of Air Staff, and MD Yusuf, the Inspector General of Police. Obasanjo was to set up a transition program which he religiously implemented until Alhaji Shehu Shagari was sworn in as the first executive president of Nigeria, notwithstanding the controversies which accompanied the election results, announcement and inauguration on October 1, 1979. However, Shagari would only preside over Nigeria for 4 years, and the country's experiment with democracy was terminated on December 31, 1983, when the military came out of their barracks and struck again. Having been sworn in on October 1, 1979, Shehu Usman Aliyu Shagari ended his first term 4 years later. It was a turbulent period for the ruling National Party of Nigeria (NPN) and the incumbent Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Nigeria's economy had taken a downward slide and the standard of living was nothing to be discussed in the open. There were other allegations of reckless squandering of the national wealth. But all these did not stop Shagari from being re-elected and sworn in October 1983, even with protests of electoral fraud by the other parties. Barely 3 months into his second term, martial music rented the airwaves once again. Amid national outcry of wasteful spending by the government, an unknown Brigadier Sani Abacha came on air to announce the death of the Shagari administration on December 31, 1983. Although Brigadier Ibrahim Bako was recorded to have died in that change of power, the intervention of the military in another democratic dispensation was one in which blood was not shed. Most of the civilian administrators voluntarily reported at the offices of the security agencies from where their journeys to long agonizing imprisonment started. In the usual cycle, the man who is overthrown becomes the biggest loser. In this regard, Shagari was the topmost casualty. Then there was Dr. Alex Ekweme, the Second Republic Vice President, as well as Drs. Olushola Saraki, Joseph Wires, and Chief Edwin Umezuoke, the leaders of the National Assembly, that is, Senate and the House of Representatives. At the state levels, the governors as well as their deputies and assemblymen also were forced to say goodbye to their dreams of running their full term. Major General Muhammadu Buhari took over from where Shagari left. He had Major General Babatunde Idiagbon as his deputy. They were also collaborators in Ibrahim Babangida and Sani Abacha, among others. Martial music at dawn had become a familiar tune to the ears of Nigerians, and when one blared from radio speakers in the morning of August 27, 1985, the citizens knew that another batch of soldiers had struck. They were correct. When the identities of those behind the plot finally emerged, General Ibrahim Babangida had forcefully snatched the baton from his former boss, Muhammadu Buhari. Again, both Buhari and Idiagbon had lost out in the military intrigues, and like manner, there were all accusations of high-handedness and insensitivity to the sufferings of Nigerians as justification for their seizing power. Babangida's regime toyed with the idea of having Nigeria as a member of the Organization of Islamic Countries (OIC), as well as taking the IMF loan and later the introduction of the Structural Adjustment Program (SAP). At each point, the government encouraged the public to debate such measures. Babangida ruled the country for 8 years, earning for himself the nicknames Maradona and Evil Genius for his deft dribbles in administering the country. The anticlimax of his regime was the annulment of the June 12, 1993 presidential election, presumably won by Chief Moshood Kashimawo Olawale MKO Abiola. But in all this, the beneficiaries of his ascension to power were General Sani Abacha, Admirals Augustus Aikomu, and Ebitu Ukiwe, who fell out with the administration at a point and had to go, plus numerous Nigerians who benefited either by appointment or being awarded lucrative contracts. At every point, the head of state, General Ibrahim Babangida, would not cease to say loudly that Major General Mamman Vatsa was his good friend. But when both crossed their different paths in a treasonable felony allegation, friendship took the back seat. Vatsa was accused of planning to violently overthrow Babangida's government in 1986. A special military tribunal was set up to try him and other co-conspirators. At the end of it all, they were found guilty of the act as charged. There were pleas for clemency by well-meaning Nigerians and other international figures and bodies, but they were to pay the maximum price. No less than 13 officers were shot and their bodies dissolved in acid. These victims included Major General Vatsa, Lieutenant Colonels Bitinyon, Oche and Iyoshe, Major Daniel Bamidele, and Naval Commodore A.A. Oguiji. Babangida and his entire cabinet, as well as their families and other military governors, were those who gained from the plot that was foiled. Perhaps no overthrow bid has been as bloody in recent times as the one embarked upon by Major Gideon Orkar and his collaborators on Sunday, April 22, 1990. Lagosians were shaken to their marrows with the bombardment that sent Obalende and its environs quaking. The intent, of course, was to dislodge Babangida and his lieutenants. The coup plotters had taken over the radio station from where they were able to broadcast to a panicky nation. In what the majority saw as extremist in conception, the plotters were condemned for excising some parts of Nigeria in their broadcasts. A strategist in matters of coup d'etats himself, Babangida, with the help of Abacha, succeeded in crushing that rebellion. But it was not without a scar. Lieutenant Colonel U.K. Bello, the aide-de-camp to Babangida, was shot and killed, and it left obvious bitterness in the mouth of the Minabon general. Soon, the perpetrators were rounded up to face trials, and was sentenced. Orkar and his fellow rebels were made to face a firing squad at a shooting range. This was outside other Nigerians who were reported to have died in connection with the mutiny. No less traumatized by the deaths handed over to their husbands and fathers were the wives, children, and even dependent relations of those killed. Again, Babangida and his cabinet ministers, state governors, service chiefs, and their families were the survivors of that deadly attempt to overthrow the government. After he assumed power as the military head of state when Chief Ernest Shonekan resigned as the head of the interim national government, General Sani Abacha was an amazing character who dazed his subjects. Oftentimes, he was underestimated, and it took time for Nigerians to appreciate that behind those dark glasses was a Nigerian Stalin, that is, a man of steel who would not blink to get his act done. In his own words, he came in to succeed the Ernest Shonekan child of circumstance government, but the pro-democracy groups mounted pressure on the Kano-born general to revalidate the mandate of Chief MKO Abiola. When MKO announced himself president, that was when the citizens came face to face with the reality that their ruler was one tough being. Abiola was arrested and later incarcerated and never returned until he died in detention on July 7, 1998. As it happened under Babangida, there were two alleged plots to remove Abacha from power, but the characters behind the two stories made one more awesome. Aside from Major General Vatsa, no other military man of note in the two coups of 1986 and 1990 confronted the Babangida regime. In the case of Abacha, it involved the heavyweights. In the alleged plot of March 1995, a former head of state, General Olusegun Obasanjo, and the second in command, Major General Shehu Musa Yar'Adua, were hounded into prisons in what they all termed to be a phantom coup. Then there was Colonel Lawan Gwadabe, a former governor of Niger State and principal staff officer to Abacha himself. Will they be killed? Can Abacha kill Obasanjo and Yar'Adua? Was there really a coup? The civilian populace did not dare dabble into the last issue because coup making is an entirely military business. Throughout the investigations, trials, and pronouncement of the sentences, Nigeria seemed to be sitting on a keg of gunpowder. Will it explode? Outside the trial, the best brains in the military like Colonels Bello Fadile and Roland Emokpae, among others, were also implicated in the alleged plots. Death sentences were handed over to the key convicts, but worldwide appeals for the government to temper justice with mercy saw Abacha and his men commuting the death verdicts to various years of jail terms. In a twinkle, all the accused were distributed to different prisons all over Nigeria. Thus, they began to languish in jails. In December 1997, Nigerians woke up to another bafflement when Lieutenant General Oladipo Odia, the Chief of General Staff, Major General Abdulkarim Adisa, former Works Minister, and Major General Tajuddin Olariwaju, former Communications Minister, were all handcuffed and brought before the Special Military Tribunal for plotting to overthrow their boss, Abacha. Colonel Yakubu Bako, a former military administrator, was among those who were to be jailed for their alleged complicity in the purported coup. Following the sudden death of Abacha on June 8, 1998, General Abdulsalami Abubakar was to inherit his predecessor's assets and liabilities. Obasanjo, Diya, Adisa, Olarewaju, and Gwadabe fell in the latter category. Obasanjo was to lead the first batch of pro-democracy activists and journalists out of the cells, courtesy of a presidential pardon. He was later to join the political train, and backed by retired generals and all, the Otafama became the first president of the Fourth Republic. But has Nigeria had the last of coup-making as a nation? Successful or aborted, bloody or bloodless, military coups are undesirable and must be condemned. Everyone recognizes its illegality and proffers that the Nigerian military must be reorientated to appreciate their real functions and their true places in the barracks. More than that, so many souls had been wasted, and as the country embraced the Fourth Republic, the new president, Olusegun Obasanjo, on June 14, 1999, ordered the retirement of every military officer who had taken a political appointment since 1983. Chief among those affected were David Mark, Buba Marwa, and Olagunsoye Oyinlola. You can check out the full story in our next episode.